Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Aquaculture Historical Society's August presentation by Dr. Jerry Schubel. What a treat we're in for this evening to have a speaker the caliber of Dr. Schubel. Dr. Schubel is one of the country's leading experts on aquaculture. He has studied, written, and spoken extensively about aquaculture for several years. He's worked with NOAA, the federal agency having to do with aquaculture. He's testified in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento about to committees focused on aquaculture. Let me tell you a little bit about Jerry Schubel, because he's got a very illustrious career. Jerry holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins University in Maryland in oceanography. For the next 20 years after obtaining his PhD, he was a professor at the State University in New York at Sunnybrook. He was dean of the university's Marine Science Research Center during those years. He was the provost of the university for the last 3 years at Sunnybrook. From 1994 to 2001, Jerry was the chief executive officer of the New England Aquarium in Boston, which I'm sure you have all visited and hold dear to your hearts. It's a terrific aquarium. After 7 years in Boston, heading up that aquarium, he was hired away by the Aquarium of the Pacific in California, the 4th largest aquarium in the United States. And I met him then, and we've been colleagues for 17 years at the aquarium, and I think so highly of him, and we're really lucky that he agreed to speak with our group tonight. Jerry left or retired from the aquarium last year. He spent the last year writing a book about Chesapeake Bay, which I urge you all to read. He's a great scientist and writer. So Jerry's remarks have been pre-recorded on Zoom, and he's prepared very rich and informative slides that are just jam-packed with information about aquaculture. After his presentation, which takes about 22 minutes, there will be a question and answer period, and questions have already been submitted to the head of the Aquaculture Historical Society, Joan Lawler, who will moderate that Q&A session, which I think will be very interesting and very robust. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature on Zoom to type them in, and we'll ask them to Jerry. So without further ado, I present to you my friend and colleague and our speaker for the night, Dr. Jerry Schubel.
Hello, I'm Jerry Schubel. I recently retired as the president of the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California. And before that, for 20 years, I was the Dean of Marine Sciences at Stony Brook University, which is part of the State University of New York system. Someone once said, the problem with history is that events never happen at the right time or in the right sequence, but that the conscientious historian corrects those deficiencies. This afternoon, I'm your conscientious historian, and I want to thank my friend and colleague, Steve Young, for giving me this opportunity. Steve has been associated with the aquarium since before it opened, and he's always been a constant source of good advice and wise counsel. Today I want to talk to you about how Rhode Island played important roles in the American Revolution and in the Industrial Revolution, and how now we need Rhode Island to play a leadership role in the Blue Revolution. It's an appropriate role for the ocean state. Rhode Island has long been a rebel rouser. It was a rebel rouser in the American Revolution. It sank the HMS Gaspé, which was a British revenue schooner, 18 months before the Boston Tea Party took place. And on May 4th, 1776, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed nearly unanimously the Act of Renunciation, renouncing the allegiance to King George III, making Rhode Island the first independent sovereign state in the Western world. Rhode Island was also a leader in the Industrial Revolution. It was a leader in power-driven textile mills and was one of the most industrialized states in the U.S. with machine tool, silverware, and costume jewelry industries. Now there's a new revolution where the U.S. needs Rhode Island's leadership. It's the Blue Revolution, to stimulate the blue economy in the United States. According to the World Bank, the blue economy is the, quote, sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, improved livelihoods, and jobs, while preserving the health of ocean ecosystems. The two biggest opportunities in the blue economy are offshore wind and aquaculture. According to the United Nations, the U.S. has the biggest opportunity of any nation in aquaculture. This comes from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. U.S. was once a leading maritime nation. Look at it, where we are. To the east, we have the Atlantic Ocean. To the west, the Pacific. To the south, the Gulf of Mexico, and to the north, we have the Arctic Ocean. Once we were a major shipbuilder and a major shipper. Those days are gone. We can no longer build the largest ships in the ocean-going fleet, and few ships today in world trade carry a U.S. flag. The U.S. EEZ, the area which is shown in blue, is the largest EEZ, that's the exclusive economic zone, of any nation on Earth. Most people don't realize how large or extensive this is. This is the area from the shoreline out 200 nautical miles. And look where we have around the Hawaiian Islands, the Midway Islands, the Northern Marianas Islands. This is really extensive. And in less than 0.5% of our EEZ, we could produce an amount of seafood equivalent to the total global wild catch. This would be equal to an area less than Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. And in that amount of our EEZ, we could produce an amount of seafood equivalent to the total global annual wild harvest of seafood. Rhode Island is uniquely qualified to lead the Blue Revolution. Block Island Wind Farm was the first wind farm in the nation. Here you can see Block Island off the end of where I used to work, Long Island. This is a map showing the state and some of the coastal bays and the salt ponds. These are aerial views and close-ups of some of the aquaculture operations in the state's salt ponds. Rhode Island has an important aquaculture industry. It's small, but it's important. It's primarily oysters, quahogs, and mussels in the salt ponds at the south end of the state. Farms are restricted to 5% of the surface area of a pond. Most are family-owned farms, and all operate under 15-year renewable leases. There are roughly 80 farms in all. Aquaculture is one of the state's most rapidly growing enterprises, and there's expressed interest in moving into Narragansett Bay to expand the opportunity. But further growth is not without challenges: competition for space, public perceptions, and permitting processes. So let's look at how aquaculture in Rhode Island compares with aquaculture in the United States. The U.S. imports more seafood than any other country on the earth, in spite of the large EEZ and the opportunity that we have. About half of the imports are from aquaculture, most from China. The U.S. is a minor aquaculture producer. In 2018, we ranked only 17th. The seafood trade imbalance is roughly $15 billion per year. The U.S. does play a fairly major role in global aquaculture through technology, feed development, and investment capital, but not here at home. Globally, wild capture fisheries have been stable for decades. Global aquaculture production has grown more rapidly to meet demand, but not in the U.S. Aquaculture production has grown only slowly in the U.S., only about 1.7% per year from 2013 to 2018. Globally, aquaculture production is the fastest growing sector of food production on Earth. In this figure, the green area to the bottom shows that from about 1985 up to the present, the wild-caught landings of seafood have been relatively flat. And the line shown there is the growth of the world population, and everything in the tan above the green demonstrates how aquaculture has grown to fill the growing demand for seafood. This is a figure that shows world aquaculture production by continent in 2008. The land areas have been adjusted to reflect the total amount of production of seafood through aquaculture. So if you look at this, you can see that North America, South America, Africa, all of Europe, they look like they've been on a strict diet. They're skinny, shriveled up. And by contrast, China is expanded, reflecting the large amount of seafood that it produces through aquaculture. This map shows areas of opportunity that we should focus on. This is a puzzle, really. It relates really to the U.S. and our failure to grasp the blue economy. Do you remember the comic strip character Pogo? He once said, "Some opportunities are so large, they are insurmountable." So we appear to be confronted with these insurmountable opportunities. They're not insurmountable. They are large, but they are not insurmountable. There are lots of advantages of growing animal protein in the ocean versus growing animal protein on land. And you would think that with our growing awareness of climate change and what it's doing and the potential for damage in the future, that we would be moving toward aquaculture, growing some of our animal protein in the ocean. Because it requires less energy, it uses much less fresh water, it releases fewer greenhouse gases, it would reduce our seafood trade deficit, and seafood is healthier for us than red meat. The blue revolution can make the future more positive. Growing plants remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and CO2 is a driving force for climate change. Growing plants in the ocean remove CO2 from the upper ocean, reducing ocean acidification. Growing plants in the ocean adds oxygen to the water, and right now we're experiencing decreases in dissolved oxygen at all water depths. Aquaculture reduces the amount of water needed to grow our food. This is a major concern in a changing climate. Nationally and internationally, agriculture consumes 70% of all developed fresh water in the US and in the world. And the Blue Revolution does not have to have the same deleterious effects we've had from the Green Revolutions. So there's our Earth. The world ocean covers 71% of it. But surprisingly, the world ocean produces only 2% of our food. And the world ocean is changing, and changing rapidly. Sea level is rising, the ocean is warming, dissolved oxygen levels are declining at all depths, the ocean is becoming more acidic, major circulation patterns are changing. The Gulf Stream is slowing down. What's called the global conveyor belt, or the Atlantic meridional overturning, slowing down. Fish populations are moving so the fish can stay within their preferred temperature ranges, leaving some fishing villages totally stranded, losing their major source of income and also some of their major attraction as tourist spots. Recently, we had a talk by Karen Huynh. She was talking with the NOAA Committee on the Blue Economy. And she made the statement that we need climate-smart agriculture. She didn't mention climate-smart aquaculture, even though she works for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Aquaculture needs to play a larger role in the nation's production of food. Recent hot spells and droughts across many parts of the country indicate the severity of these problems. And as I mentioned, agriculture uses 70% of the world's developed freshwater and the developed freshwater in the United States. Why? Why as a nation do we invest so little in developing aquaculture? It's a climate-smart way to produce some of our food. I think it's a factor of misinformation and of a permitting process. Our permitting process really strangles innovation. It strangles it at the national level and in many, maybe most ocean states. And I think that's also a result of the failure of the scientific community to make the case for aquaculture. Perceptions matter a lot in all of this. If you look at the red bars to the left, this is the proportion of sentiment that's negative when it comes to aquaculture. Look at the USA. It has the highest negative perception of aquaculture of any country, followed by Australia and Canada and Ireland. And if you look at the blue bars, those are positive perceptions. Look at China, Bahrain, Malaysia, Portugal, New Zealand. And it's interesting that in the US, the majority of negative comments about aquaculture come from environmental NGOs, environmental non-governmental organizations, and the publics associated with them. I was the president of an environmental NGO, the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California, for 18 years. And we often were criticized for supporting aquaculture. People questioned how could we do that since we were a conservation organization. My answer was always the same. We support it because we are a conservation organization. So how do you address public misperceptions? The same set of things that we have for climate change, and we've seen it now with vaccinations for COVID-19. You have to collaborate with diverse stakeholder groups. You have to create and deliver cohesive, science-based messages and deliver them over and over and over. You have to promote scientific and technological advances. We need to highlight aquaculture's role as a conservation tool. And yes, we need to acknowledge the potential risks and put them in context. Aquaculture has made mistakes in the past, some serious mistakes, but aquaculture today is very unlike what aquaculture was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now, some of you may be wondering, if we have all these challenges in coastal waters, why not just move out into federal waters, into the EEZ? We have lots of space. The EEZ goes out 200 miles. The problem is that when you go out there, nobody's in charge. If you want to site a farm, you have to go to NOAA, the Department of Defense, the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Geological Survey, the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And it takes a long, long time to get any answer. You remember Carnac the Magnificent on the old Johnny Carson show, where Johnny Carson, dressed as Carnac, would hold up an envelope that he had taken from a jar that had been on the front porch of Funk and Wagnall's, sealed since early that morning. He would hold the envelope to his head, divine the answer to the question that was contained within the envelope, and then open the envelope and read the question. I want you to imagine me dressed as Carnac, holding an envelope to my head. The answer is not in your lifetime. And then I open the envelope, take out the question inside, and it says, how long will it take you to get a farm permitted in the EEZ? It's almost that bad. We don't have a single finfish farm permitted in the United States EEZ, and we only have one, maybe two shellfish farms. So, this could change. We have an executive order for NOAA to establish 2 aquaculture opportunity areas off Southern California and 2 in the Gulf of Mexico. This was in an executive order issued in May of 2020 that directs NOAA to establish 25 aquaculture opportunity areas in the US EEZ by 2025. The first 4 are, as I said, to have 2 in Southern California and 2 in the Gulf of Mexico. Aquaculture opportunity areas are intended to promote American seafood competitiveness and economic growth. Each area is to be large enough to accommodate at least 2 farms large enough to be economically profitable and therefore attractive to investors. They can grow finfish, shellfish, algae, or some combination of these. And the basic environmental impact reviews are to be completed and available for potential farmers. So why Rhode Island? Rhode Island is the ideal state to take a leadership role. Your former governor, Gina Raimondo, is now the Secretary of Commerce, the home of NOAA. And Sheldon Whitehouse, Senator, is the chair of the Ocean Caucus. Both are visionary leaders, both are supportive of aquaculture. You have 2 leading Rhode Island institutions that are important for the blue economy. One, the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography, long a leader in aquaculture and fisheries and all areas of oceanography. And then you have the Rhode Island Sea Grant Program, which has been a leader in developing aquaculture tools and techniques and strategies. Perhaps the single most important thing Rhode Island could do to get the U.S. more fully engaged in the Blue Revolution in offshore aquaculture would be to take a leadership role in getting NOAA designated as the lead federal agency for permitting of farms in the EEZ. This would require an act of Congress, a potential role for the Ocean Caucus. So, I think it's time for us to start this Blue Revolution, and I think Rhode Island is the place to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Schubel. I think we all learned a lot, even from this short presentation, but now we have a number of questions that I think would enhance our understanding in this area. I just want to mention, though, we do have 2 local experts in this field who are members of our Historical Society, and they've been gracious enough to say that they would chime in if there's some local, issue or something that could help further understanding of the question. But, and one of them is Steve Pete, and then we're gonna enable a video on Sheila Andrew. So I'm going to start it off because, I just also want to say that if you have a question, please use the chat. We had gotten a number of questions that were forwarded prior to the talk, so I'm going to start with those. But if anybody on the Zoom meeting right now has a question, please add it to the chat and we'll get to it. Okay, so first up, you mentioned the historical mistakes that have been made regarding aquaculture and the negative sentiment in the US towards aquaculture and that those mistakes caused. What were those mistakes and have they been cured?
Well, among the mistakes were we often cited finfish farms in the wrong locations, areas that didn't have good circulation and rapid renewal of water. We often overstocked the cages. We often overfed so that the food would accumulate on the seafloor and degrade the bottom and the overlying water column. And those I think are the primary things that mistakes that we made with finfish. And then with shellfish, I think we destroyed a lot of mangroves and wetlands to create places to grow shrimp. Particularly in places like Indonesia. We now do a much better job. We have the tools to pick the best sites. We know how to keep from overfeeding. Cameras are placed below the cages. If any uneaten food goes through the cage to the bottom, the feeding mechanisms are automatically shut off. We know enough not to overstock. And I think there's been a move to protect mangroves and not be growing shrimp in these sensitive areas.
Okay, thank you. Next up is, in the Western US and in much of the world, there's a shortage of water. In fact, 70% of water supply goes to agriculture. How can aquaculture help with the water shortage issue?
Nationally and internationally, agriculture uses 70% of all the developed water on the planet. And we're seeing increasing droughts, not only in the US Southwest, but throughout many parts of this country and throughout the world. And so agriculture is going to have to change. And much of the water that goes to agriculture goes to grazing protein, particularly cattle. We know that with aquaculture, it's a good source of protein. And if you grow it offshore, the only fresh water that's used is used in the processing of the fish after they are landed. So the water requirements, the freshwater requirements go down dramatically. And I think what we need to do is to work toward having a sustainable agricultural industry combined with a sustainable aquaculture industry in producing food for the future.
Jerry, is there a way you can increase your volume?
Yes.
Okay, or sit closer to the mic, that would be helpful. We want to hear every word you're saying.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, next up, because most of our aquaculture produced food products come from outside the United States, there may be concerns about how the products are produced and what chemicals may be used. Food safety inspection is essential and currently cannot keep up with the influx of products. Do you think that seafood safety would be improved with more farm-raised seafood produced within the EEZ of the United States?
I don't think there's any question about that. The U.S. has some of the most stringent environmental standards and food safety standards of any country in the world. And it's true, we import so much of our seafood, and only a very small percentage of what's imported can ever be evaluated for food safety. And then in addition, you have on top of that questions of how the products are grown and harvested. And we know that there are a lot of bad things that happen in parts of the world in terms of human rights. So yes, if we could produce more of our seafood nationally within our own EEZ, we could greatly reduce those problems.
Okay, thank you. How does the increase in microplastics in the ocean impact the goal to increase animal protein from aquaculture?
I don't think it probably increases it very much. You know, microplastics, they're ubiquitous, and we should reduce the plastics that are in the ocean. The way to do that is not trying to remove them once they're in the ocean, but reducing them at the sources of where they originate. And the biggest problems come from how much plastics are introduced by rivers, and the primary sources are rivers in Asia, and we should work to keep plastics out of the ocean. Microplastics generally are produced by the breakdown of plastics. Since most plastics don't degrade biochemically, they degrade physically into smaller and smaller particles. But I don't see this as a big problem for aquaculture.
Unfortunately, we see those visions of this plastic ending up, you know, in odd spots, you know, that obviously is kind of scary. Can you compare the cost of wild-caught aquatic biomass to farmed aquatic biomass?
Well, wild caught is much more expensive, particularly when you look at things like wild salmon. And salmon, we know, is a very helpful source of protein. And we're told that by many medical people, we should eat more salmon. And you can buy farm-raised salmon at a fraction of the cost at places like Costco and so on. And there are many people who are unable to afford wild-caught salmon. Farm-raised salmon is every bit as good, tastes just as good, and it's just as healthy for you. And so I say, go buy wild-caught salmon. I mean, buy farm-raised salmon and eat it. We should all eat it at least once a week and maybe twice a week.
That brings me to another related question. Do farmed fish have higher or lower levels of mercury?
Well, mercury is an interesting contaminant. If you look at mercury in seafood, mercury in wild-caught seafood, it's a function of the age and the size of the animal. So wild-caught tuna and sharks and those large pelagic animals, the older they get, the bigger they get, the more mercury they have. And the smaller fish are the ones that are lower in mercury, and farm-raised generally are smaller than what we harvest in the wild. So mercury should not be an issue in most seafood that we eat, either wild-caught or farm-raised. And this is something, though, we know what the concentrations tend to be, and we know what levels are bad for people. And there are some protected groups. So pregnant women, nursing women should eat less, children should eat less. It's a complicated issue, but we know enough, and there are enough guidelines that people should not avoid eating fish because of their fear of mercury. They should use caution in selecting the seafood they do eat.
Okay, here's another one. If we open more aquaculture sites in our EEZ, would we continue to outsource aquaculture production to non-US firms? That is, could US-owned aquaculture compete profit-wise with Asia?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. If we can make spaces available in the EEZ, if we can have the basic permits in place, and if we can reduce the cost of entry to have a farm, then I think we can be competitive. Right now, we have permitting processes that strangle innovation, and the cost of getting a farm is so high, and some of the monitoring requirements are outlandish in terms of their costs. So we need to get our arms around this and decide that we want to have an aquaculture industry. And so, yes, we could do it, and we could have things competitive, because we have advanced technology, and it's not just cost of labor that's a factor here.
Okay, here's another one. Many shellfish species distribute their reproductive cells freely, and finfish enclosures occasionally rupture and release farmed fish to interbreed with wild stock. I didn't even know that could happen, but I guess it can. Can you talk some about the risk this poses to wild species, especially species like migrating salmon?
Well, I think one of the things that we should do is, if we're going to have raised farm finfish, we should make sure that we raise only species that are native to a particular area. The risks of escape are getting smaller and smaller with better technology. And it isn't clear from the Northwest, that's where the concern is, because for decades we've tried to raise Atlantic salmon in the Northwest, and we've intentionally, mind you, released millions and millions of Atlantic salmon, and we have not established wild stocks of Atlantic salmon, so they haven't been successful in breeding and interbreeding. But I think it's still safer to raise species that are native to an area to eliminate the perception of that risk.
Okay. Okay, we have a question from the chat. Are most Asian fish farms offshore or inshore? Is offshore farming less productive?
Well, it's a mixture. There are more that are inshore and even on land than there are offshore. But China, for example, is moving offshore, and like every place has this competition for space, the closer to shore that you get. And so there are advantages to moving offshore, although the costs go up, some of the difficulties go up. But I think the future of ocean farming in the United States particularly is offshore in the EEZ. And that's another reason why I think Rhode Island has an important role to play. You're the ocean state. Let's move out into the ocean and take advantage of all of the opportunities it offers to the United States.
Okay, next one. This is a little long, but stay with me here. In the US, the trend has clearly been for corporate industrial aquaculture to replace the family farm. This has led to more efficient farming with less concern about maintaining soil fertility for future generations, and in some circumstances, more aggressive adoption of herbicides, antibiotics, and pesticides. Corporate economic power has facilitated this with its ability to hire expensive lobbyists and make large campaign donations. How do you see the future role of corporate involvement in aquaculture?
Well, all of those I think, are valid concerns. But before we go to aquaculture, the small family farm has an important role to play. But we also have to think about the large population that we have to feed, not only growing in the United States, but on the planet. And so it will be a combination of responsible industrial agriculture, large scale, to feed large numbers of people, and small family farms. We can reduce many of these problems. People they object to genetically modified crops. We eat them every day. There's not a person listening today that doesn't eat genetically modified crops. We can grow crops that require less water, that require less pesticide, less herbicide, less fertilizer, and it will not compromise their nutritional value, and we can do that, and we should do that. I think we have to make it possible for small farmers to get involved in aquaculture. Now, Rhode Island and your coastal farms, those are small family farms. And many of them go back many decades. To move out into the EEZ, it takes greater expense. You have to have bigger boats, et cetera. And so this is going to be dominated by larger groups. But I do think we can control that, and we don't have to let them. It's just like with the blue revolution. You know, if you think of the green revolution, we've had 7, and it had many beneficial impacts. It prevented all of the mass starvations that were predicted by people from Malthus up to the people at Stanford. But there's nothing that has taken a larger toll on the earth than green revolutions. The blue revolution gives us an opportunity to show how we can farm 70% of the earth and do it in a responsible way without degrading the environment. I'm hoping that's what we will do. And we have all the tools, scientific, technological. I think the one tool we don't have at the state level or at the federal level is to incorporate the best science into policy before policies are made. And that's something this nation needs to work on.
Okay, here's another one. Is offshore versus inshore fish farming more environmentally friendly?
I would say yes. Offshore fish farming is more environmentally friendly than close to shore. I think if you look at the benefits of growing shellfish in coastal areas, shellfish are seen as environmental janitors. They clean the water. You can see that in your bays in Rhode Island. It's one of the big tools in cleaning up Chesapeake Bay. That's not true of finfish. I don't think that means that we should rule out any finfish operations in coastal waters necessarily, but the advantages of going offshore, I think, are significantly greater for finfish than they are for shellfish, and the advantages of going into the VEC are greater than trying to build finfish industries close to shore.
Okay, there are several seaweed producers in Connecticut. Their main challenge is finding a market for their products. Do you have any ideas? Do you have any experience in this area?
Well, I think that finding the markets, and you know, that is Charlie Garish is the guy at the University of Connecticut, has been leading those every long time. Back when I was at Stony Brook for 20 years, Charlie was doing this. There will be markets. There will be markets for food because seaweeds, kelp, they're good for humans. They're healthful foods. We now know that if you feed some certain kinds of kelp to cattle, you reduce the methane that cattle release, which is a strong greenhouse gas. And kelp it's different kinds of algae and kelp have great uses in the biomedical fields and even the potential for creating biofuels, which will become more important in the future. So I think it will come. And the people who have been with it for a long time, I think we'll see that happen within the next decade or so.
Good. Okay, is there an educational group that can help small aquaculture producers move to the EEZ?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Is there an educational group that can help small aquaculture producers move to the EEZ?
Yes, I think, you know, it's interesting. Much of the leadership in aquaculture on the East Coast of the United States came out of Rhode Island. And Maine is probably the leading state now in terms of its innovative uses of aquaculture of all kinds. And Barry Costa Pierce, who used to be at the University of Rhode Island and the University of Rhode Island Sea Grant Program is a dean now in Maine. I think Sea Grant is one of the organizations that needs to help remove some of the public perceptions that are barriers to offshore aquaculture.
Okay, Rhode Island has had several shoreline salt ponds which have proven good sites for aquaculture leases. Some of these have proven incompatible with other salt pond uses, such as kayaking, fishing, water skiing, snorkeling. Presently, as you stated, Rhode Island law allows 5% of pond surfaces to be sold as aquaculture leases. What do you believe is the ideal percentage and how should it be arrived at?
I don't think there is an ideal percentage, but I think Rhode Island is good in restricting the percentage because it all depends on what are the other uses in that particular lagoon. So 5% seems to me that's a pretty conservative measure. And in some cases that it maybe could be larger than that, but I wouldn't argue with the state's 5%. I don't think there's any magic number.
What role do you think climate change has had on aquaculture?
Well, aquaculture has been impacted by climate change, I think, but less than wild capture fisheries. One of the big impacts we're seeing on wild capture fisheries is that finfish are moving to stay within their preferred temperature ranges. So we see a migration of fish along the East Coast to higher latitudes to stay within cooler temperatures. Chesapeake Bay, for example, which is typical of other bays, we're seeing an exodus of some of the most popular fish. They're moving farther north to stay within their temperature range, and that will increase in the future. Aquaculture gives more opportunities because with aquaculture, particularly offshore, you can move a farm vertically and you can reduce the amount of temperature fluctuation vertically in a much shorter distance than you would have to do horizontally. So the aquaculture and fisheries have both been impacted. It will be impacted in the future, but aquaculture offers us advantages and it reduces greenhouse gas generation, reduces the amount of water, etc.
I just want to take this moment to ask Steve and Pete or Sheila. Andrew, I know you've asked some questions which I've relayed already, but is there any insights that you have as local experts in this area? Or questions, or more questions for Dr. Schubel?
Sheila, go ahead.
You're on mute, Sheila.
I'm off now.
Yes.
First of all, thank you, but I will have to say that Steve Pete is the expert. I am more on the animal agriculture side, but I have moved into the finfish and shellfish working with students in study abroad. And the two aspects that I see to be able to see Jerry's vision to fruition is that we want to produce a quality product. And that's already happening in Rhode Island in the oyster industry and what's happening with our aquaculture. If you have a high quality product without any contamination, without any concerns with food safety, that's very important. And I just wanted to relay something we learned in Ireland and finfish. We visit each year, except for the last couple of years, a aquaculture industry that has salmon, and it's aquaculture raised salmon, and it's organic. And if you know that one of the concerns with salmon is sea lice that will attach to the fish. And because they're organic, they're able to take care of most of the problem by putting in another type of fish called lumpfish that eats the lice off the finfish. And I think it's answers to questions like this that could really help the U.S., move forward. And I think that up in Maine, they might be doing this already. But that's my knowledge. I think Steve has a lot more knowledge about our local industry.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for saying that, but I'm anything but an expert. Our family has a small oyster farm that we operate in Quaney Pond, and I can attest to the difficulty in getting permitting to do that. And I actually had to say I understand why it's difficult. I mean, there's a lot of competing interests for that water, and our commercial interest, shouldn't overrun someone else's interest in kayaking or canoeing or fishing or whatnot. That said, it's extremely satisfying growing oysters. I feel like we're cleaning the water. I don't have a lot of knowledge on salmon farming, but I know it's a very contentious issue, and I know a few years back the practices were pretty questionable, especially the inshore farming, where the waste product coming from the salmon may have been more detrimental than the protein we were getting out of it. And Jerry, you have a much more educated opinion on that than I do, but Rhode Island, we are the ocean state, and it's we take a lot of pride in being part of that, even though it's just a tiny little farm. I do think that aquaculture, and certainly shellfish aquaculture, is very good for our pond health. There's an awful lot of stress put on these ponds, and in some way, in some small part, the aquaculture industry is helping that.
That's right. Shellfish are a big factor in cleaning up coastal waters. There's a number that gets bandied around that the average adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. Now that's probably only during the warmer summer months, but still, when John Smith sailed into Chesapeake Bay, the estimate then was that the population of oysters was so abundant, they filtered a volume of water equivalent to the entire Chesapeake Bay every few days. Now the abundance of oysters is so low that it takes them probably a year to filter a volume of water equivalent to the bay. And the Chesapeake Bay has a very large program of planting oysters to try to regain that crop. So hang on there to your farm, and yeah, I think you guys are very important to the health of our coastal waters.
Is it too late for a pond like Green Hill Pond? They've been suffering for years in trying to clean that up, but I have to imagine that oysters don't want to live there either.
I don't know anything about that pond. Maybe Steve
Green Hill
does.
Pond has some unique issues.
It doesn't have a breachway, but one, right?
One of them, very little water turnover. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jerry, do you remember the speaker that the aquarium hosted a few years ago? And the goal was to clean up New York City pollution, and the entity that had a goal of planting or seeding 1 billion oysters all around some of the most polluted areas in New York. It sounded wonderful. Did it work?
Well, they're still in the process. They haven't reached 1 billion yet, but I've forgotten how many 100 million or so they have. And yes, I think it's too early to tell. But oysters used to be very abundant in and around New York Harbor, and those populations were both over-harvested, and they were also decimated by pollution coming from New York Harbor and the East River. But these attempts to use nature to clean up some of our coastal waters, I think, are a very good thing. And a point I want to come back to that Angela pointed out, and Steve, and one I made earlier. We have a great deal of knowledge and technology at our disposal in the United States, and we could become leaders in aquaculture in the EEZ. In many ways, we export the knowledge we have to other countries because you can't get the permits here in the United States. And that's too bad, because then we are the loser, and the trade imbalance is something in the order of $15 billion a year. So we lose jobs, opportunities to produce a high quality, high value, high protein, healthful seafood.
Well, if they can move the condition of the East River, I think they could help the Green Hill Pond.
Well, and the East River, it has been helped. And the person you mentioned earlier from Connecticut, he's growing algae kelp in the East River. Back when I was at Stony Brook 20 some years ago, we talked about having kelp harvest. And there the case was to reduce the levels of nutrients in the western Long Island Sound, to harvest the kelp and to use it to create biofuel. And that was funded by the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA.
Okay. Okay, we only have time for one more question. I'm going to leave it here. Is there resistance in the U.S. to eating farm-raised shellfish and finfish? Can't say that 3 times fast.
There's much more resistance to eating farm-raised finfish than there is shellfish. I'm not sure that there's much resistance to eating farm-raised shellfish, and most of the shellfish that we have, either it's farm-raised or comes from coastal areas, and I don't know of any opposition to eating oysters, mussels, cohogs, and so on. Eating some finfish, there is. Salmon was brought up earlier, and there have been a number of studies on this, and I think it's more a question of perception than it is of scientific evidence. So I eat farm
It's
fish.
harder to overcome sometimes, right?
Oh, much. I eat farm salmon all the time.
Okay. Sheila, did you have a question?
Yes, let me lower my hand. It's actually a question from a friend who wasn't able to get on, Leo Manelli. His question is, will offshore fish be more expensive due to maintenance and transport over long distances?
Well, they'd be more expensive than if they were raised nearer shore. But again, it comes back to a point that one of you made before. If you have a high quality product that's fresh, people will pay more for it. And so we have a lot of potential to do this. And if you consider transporting something from the edge of the middle of, say, the continental shelf off Rhode Island, that's 50 miles away. That's not as expensive as transporting something from China, 5,000 miles away. So you have to put it all into perspective.
Okay. Any final thoughts, Steve, Pete, or Sheila? Okay, Dr. Schubel, I just want to thank you. This has been very enlightening. You know, I think I'm going to think about this in a whole different way now that I'm armed with some facts and a better understanding of what aquaculture is. So we thank you for all the time you spent in putting this program together. And thank you, Steve, for leading the
I
program.
would thank all of you for giving me the opportunity. And thank you again, Steve. Appreciate it.
Good. Okay, thank you, everyone.